So I've covered off hardware, software and services. I've covered off the different layers of the technology stack, things you're going to buy. The next thing to cover off is probably the different companies that form part of the technology supply chain. And I'm going to piss off half the industry here because I've got particularly strong views on some of the companies in this supply chain, and everyone thinks they're really important. But fundamentally, the only people who really matter are the people buying the technology. And I think, some of the technology companies get a bit arrogant in their own right. Anyway, put that to one side, I'm not going to complain. Again, it's a stack, and I think it's worth just considering it in layers because there are a number of different things you need to consider to deliver an IT service or an IT outcome. At the bottom, and not philosophically, but just in my head, are what we would call vendors. And they are the people who either make the technology, both from a hardware, manufacturers, or from a software developer's perspective. So big vendors that most people would have heard of would be on the hardware side of things, HP, Dell, those sorts of big IT companies that make hardware that everyone consumes in terms of laptops and servers and those sort of things. The other side of the coin is software vendors, and they would be things like Oracle, Microsoft, SAP, Salesforce. They're fundamentally the people who design and build technology that people generally consume. Now they're sort of interesting, and they are clearly big market leaders. There are thousands of different companies that make different types of technologies, from the big common ones like Microsoft and HP, through to niche people who make specific medical technology or specific widgets that make certain things do certain things. But those are the bottom of the supply chain. They are the people who are doing the actual clever stuff, and they are the people who design and basically set the agenda on what technology is available in the market. Oh, hold on, we're getting an emergency. No, we're all good. So we're going to ignore that distress call, Caroline, because it's really important we're doing this. So that's the bottom of the food chain. That is the vendors. And obviously beneath them, in hardware terms, you've got people like material supply, you've got all sorts of different coding type languages. I'm not going to cover those off. In my mind, those technology vendors are the bottom of the stack. At the top of the stack, you've got the buyers, and they're the people who actually want to buy technology to fulfill a business purpose. So that is your industry-facing clients, different companies doing different things. And they're the two ends of the spectrum, and everything in the middle is what is generally known as the channel. And the channel is an interesting historical debate. In the beginning, back in the God knows how long ago, 50s or 60s, when there was very few hardware vendors and very few software vendors, those hardware and software vendors were very focused on engineering. And so they weren't very good at distributing their product to people who wanted to buy it. And although there was sort of a handful of companies that were actually doing okay out of it, like people like IBM back in the day, they realized that if they wanted to mass market these sorts of technologies, they needed a clearer way of getting their hardware and software to their customers. And so they created the first tier of the channel, which is generally known as distribution. And they originally were primarily focused on providing stock, getting access, stockpiling inventory of hardware and software, and credit, giving people ability to finance different IT projects. Now they've evolved, the distribution layer still exists. There's probably about 30 or 40 major companies in the UK that are distributors. They won't sell to, generally, IT end users. They won't sell to companies of their own right. They'll sell through the next layer up to allow, to effectively broker the agreement between the end user and the vendor, right? So the distribution. As a procurement person, unless you work in the IT sector, you're probably never going to deal with a distributor. But they're a really valuable part of the chain, and I work quite closely with distribution. They offer all sorts of things like training and enablement to allow the rest of the channel, to fulfill their obligations with regards to technology. 2 seconds. Caroline, can you whip it in a little bit, just a little bit closer? Just put it on a slow tick and take a left. I might want to edit this bit out, I don't know, see how you feel. So you've got distributors, they used to do stock and credit, they now do a lot more. But that is basically the start point of the channel. The next layer up is probably the most basic of service companies, and that is your reseller. So they are companies that only really do fulfillment of IT needs. So they will organise the logistics of getting a PC or a server or a piece of software to an end user buyer. Pretty much all they do is that. So they will facilitate that transaction. Although I'm making it sound very simple, it is quite complex, making sure that the end user's buying the right thing, making sure it arrives on time, making sure it's configured in the right way. But their service capability is pretty limited. And if you want to buy things fairly cheaply, they are a robust set of the supply chain to go and engage with a reseller, but you've got to be aware that they're not going to do much to facilitate any help or any services over and above what you might need to make that technology work. That reseller channel is gone through a bit of an existential crisis over the last 20 years. Most of them have realised there's not a lot of margin in just fulfilling hardware orders or software orders, and so they've moved into higher end services. And that higher end services is probably the next layer up, which is your managed service provider. Now this is a big bucket. I think there's something like 11,000 companies in the UK that fulfill managed services, and they range from the very small to the big companies that tend to focus on the corporate. But the sort of things they do are take that technology stuff and make it work. So they will fulfill service orders, they'll make sure that the technology delivers the outcome that people need. They will maintain it, they will run it in terms of making sure it's working correctly. In some cases, they'll monitor it proactively, they'll provide help desks. I'm currently sitting here watching Caroline panic on the wheel, but that's okay because we're okay. So that managed service provider layer is actually the main part of the channel. And picking the right managed service provider, as I previously mentioned, is all about culture, it's all about awareness of the technologies you want to use, but probably also awareness of your industry. If you work in retail, you probably want to pick a managed service provider who understands how retail operate. So that managed service provider layer is a massive part of the channel. Above them, you have what used to be known as systems integrators. They're still known as systems integrators, but service integrators, there's a whole raft of different titles for them, but they tend to be the bigger companies. So this is your Accentures, Capgeminis, even IBM, big companies that are global, that will do typically some of the more complex, big projects to make more complex IT estates work correctly. They tend to be the preserve of corporates, they tend to engage with bigger projects, they tend to look for sizable projects, and in that regard, it's pretty limited in terms of the amount of people who would be engaging with them on a broad procurement basis, other than major corporates or specialist providers who need specialist skills in a certain area. So that is what we've known as the channel. Obviously you've got buyers at the top, vendors at the bottom, and a big mix of different companies, probably about 15,000 companies in the UK, all of whom do different levels of service and different things to make your technology work for you.